Give them a few seconds, then we can go.
Are we ready?
We're ready.
Great. Very good to see you again. I find that the most striking fact in the sugar market at the moment is that nobody has any conviction. Do you have any conviction, Stephen?
Not a huge amount. It's quite a confusing market, as you've just said. So I was talking with somebody at the team here at CZ earlier today, where we were effectively discussing, now we're at somewhere near 20 cents, whether we'd be at 18 next or 22. And I said I was leaning a bit more towards being at 18 cents next, and he laughed and said, well, actually, he'd be on the other side of that and thought we'd be closer to 22 next. So I don't think there's a huge amount of conviction, certainly not on my part. And I think also you can see that from speculators in sugar who are very happy to be short of sugar for a while, but have recently bought back most of that short, but are still not really going long either. So effectively, the speculators are just coming out of the market and sitting on their hands. So yeah, I agree, Robin. Low conviction at the moment.
I think the reason is that in the last 3 years, sugar's gone through such convulsions. We've been down to 9 cents in 2020. We had COVID. The Chinese stocked up. We went back up again. We got out of the gravitational pull of the ethanol parity in Brazil. So now we have no anchor, no reference point. And we got up to 28 cents. We thought we had a deficit last year. And then suddenly Brazil increased their production by 9 million tons, which compensated for the fact that we lost India as an exporter. So huge convulsions, lack of understanding as usual about what's happening to consumption in the short term, and worries, of course, about stock levels, which we're never very confident of. So a lack of conviction could go either way. I find your range is rather modest. You're talking about 18 or 22 cents, and certainly for the last 6 months, that's the range that's prevailed. I must admit a prejudice in the opposite direction. I'm very impressed by the lack of rain in Center-South Brazil. So why don't we talk straight about that? It's the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
What do you think about the current crop anyway?
So I think there's still a lot of cane there to be harvested. So if you go back 3 months ago, I think whenever I spoke to somebody in Brazil and said we were assuming 610 million tons of cane, firstly they said that was the lower end of the range and it could be a lot higher. And then they said that actually that's more like the upper end of the range. We're now in a position where we think that 610 is too much. It's been too dry in Brazil. They probably won't harvest that much cane. It may be closer to something like 590 million tons of cane. And the funny thing is, a lot of the mills that we speak to say that there is still there's plenty of cane to process. They're not worried about the cane volume. So that gives us a bit more comfort on the 590. And it's still a pretty big cane number. That's not crop failure by anyone's definition. To be in and around 600 million tons is still an excellent cane output for Brazil. So for the moment, I'm relatively relaxed about how the cane is performing with the dry weather, and we'll just have to keep watching as the crushing figures come through in the coming fortnights.
But the forecasts have been very clearly in favor of continuing dryness right into August. Surely the cane that suffered from a very poor rainy season, admittedly a good March and decent April, but has now been almost without rain in May and June. Some parts of Sao Paulo have been without any rain at all for the last 70 days. So even if the cane is okay today, what's it going to be like in a month's time if it still hasn't rained?
Difficult to tell. One of the problems we have with Brazil is it's such a big cane area and it can be very heterogeneous. So An absence of rain in one farm, one field doesn't necessarily mean you've had an absence nearby. And so it's very difficult to draw widespread conclusions. I mean, I agree the rainy season in December through to February wasn't great, but then March and April was better. And we're in the dry season now, so you'd expect there to be low to no rainfall. Having said that, cane's quite a resilient crop, and the mills have been making good money, so have been able to spend more on their crops. So, as I said earlier, I think I'm just going to have to wait and see about how the fortnightly figures come through over the next few fortnights, how the cane crush looks. I did ask our team in Brazil earlier today if we're making an adjustment to our cane number, if we're going from 610 to 590, rather than making a couple of small adjustments through the season, wouldn't it be better to make one big adjustment now? And they stressed that the mills that we speak to can see there is cane available there to be harvested, and they're not panicking at the moment around the cane throughput, the cane volume that they expect to crush.
I think most consensus is somewhere between 40 and 42 million tons of sugar. And we're quite close to the bottom end of that. We're around 40.5. Presumably you're a little bit more optimistic on the basis of what you just said.
Yes, so we're at 41 and a half. I think anywhere between 40 and 42, as you said, is a pretty good number. The other thing to bear in mind is that there's still a massive sugar production for Brazil. I mean, it wasn't so long ago that anything in the mid-30s was a very large output. So even if Brazil hits the bottom end of that range and makes 40 million tons of sugar, that is one of the highest outputs on record. And so for me, it's very easy to get wrapped up with this whole story about how the cane is not performing and how each fortnight the numbers are a bit below where you'd like them to be. And yet, even if you take a negative outlook on the Brazil crop, you're still talking potentially about 40 million tons of sugar. That, up until this time last year, people would have seen that as being a wonderful sugar production output.
But we've just ended a year where we had 42.5 million tons of sugar production. And we ended it with, I would have said, relatively low stocks, a little bit of extra stock in India, but we'll come to India in a second.
Yep.
If, like me, you think that India won't export, in a sense, it doesn't matter what happens in India. And then very slight increase in stocks in Central-South Brazil. So I say that was a year where we certainly broke even. We certainly had balance. We probably had a small surplus, and yet we're continuing with very low stocks. I think that's clear because the market is still in inverse, so nobody has the incentive to buy for stock. So with low stocks and weather risks, and only a small surplus last year, and we're going to if we only make 40 million tons, then we're going to lose 2.5 million tons of Brazilian production. I call that a recipe for an elevated price, somewhere around 20 cents. Do you think that fits?
It definitely adds the risk, because for this year, particularly for the rest of 2024, the sugar market is so dependent on Brazil for supply. So any hint that there are problems with production or logistics flows, and I think that does make people jumpy. And so over the last couple of weeks, where you've had the fire at the Tiplam terminal in Brazil, and where you've had reports of the crop not performing, I'm not surprised a lot of the speculators have covered their shorts. What I would say for this coming season is that, for me, if you look at globally at the sugar supply, the question has never been about Brazilian sugar production. It's about how much of that sugar Brazil can make available to the world market. So going from 43 million tons of sugar production forecast to 41.5 doesn't really matter, because in our estimates, Brazil was never going to be able to export that much sugar anyway. Yeah. Exactly. And one thing I would say is last year, I think the sugar market had a massive escape because the weather was so dry in November, December, January, February, that Brazil exported way more sugar than anybody could have imagined. The export flow is just huge. And it's possible that happens again this year. but I wouldn't put that as my base scenario. So for me, the chances of Brazil being able to export as much sugar as it did last year, this year, it's just a much lower chance. And so I think that gives you an element of risk in the market. I think that does make people jumpy, and I think that is one of the reasons why we're still up and in around 20 cents. So there's definitely a sort of risk premium there for that huge dependence on Brazil, and Brazilian weather and Brazilian logistics flow.
And what do you think is the direction of travel? Is the function of the market to make sure we have enough going forward as world population means slight consumption growth, a couple of million tons a year? Or do you think, on the contrary, one day we'll see India back as an exporter and we will always be able to count on Centre-South Brazil to go on increasing the sugar mix and therefore sugar tonnage, and next year we're going to have the new COFCO terminal, so the logistic problems you mentioned will be a thing of the past? What is the direction that we need to go in your opinion?
So in the very long term, so if we're going to talk about the rest of the decade, there is going to be a problem at some point with all the different potential uses for sucrose. So you can use it as sugar for food, you can use it to make ethanol for road fuel. Some of that ethanol may eventually end up being used for sustainable aviation fuel. So in the very long term, I see there being a lot of demand for sugar as a feedstock, and at the moment, based on the production capacity we have around the world, I don't think we have enough production to meet that demand. So very long term, I'd be quite bullish on sugar's demand prospects. In the much shorter term, if the weather is kind, you can see a situation where production rebounds in India, production rebounds in Thailand. Brazil is able to sustain high production thanks to the investments that have gone into the industry in the last couple of years. And so I can see a situation where world sugar stocks become more plentiful. The world is better supplied. So in the much shorter term, I think actually we're probably now in the next bear market. Touch wood somewhere, just because obviously if something goes wrong with Brazil in the short term, then that's a bad statement. But if you assume India can go back to 40 million tons of sucrose, if you assume that Thailand can go back to 13-14 million tons of sugar, if Brazil can sustain in the mid 40s, you can quite easily get to a position where globally you're making 200 million tons of sugar for food, and that is enough to meet global consumption. And so potentially we should be in a bear market for the short term. The only thing I'd add to that is that I think the bear market that's coming, or the bear market that we're in, will be much shorter than the 9-year bear market we had in the 2010s, because we've not really seen a huge amount of investment in production outside of Brazil and in India. In India, that investment has mostly been into ethanol distillation. In Brazil, it's been into sugar crystallization, but we've not seen a huge amount of growth in cane or beet acreage anywhere else. And so I don't think it's a very resilient bear market that we're moving into, but I do actually think we are now entering or are already in the next bear market.
Very interesting. I do think you're perhaps leaving on one side extreme weather. Whether we like it or not, we're in extreme weather. It's done a lot of damage. And I think we're in a situation where if it doesn't rain in Centre-South Brazil on the next opportunity, which I think comes up in about 7 or 8 days, where there is a cold front moving north, could reach the main regions, Sao Paulo state, the north, but may not. We think it probably won't. And if it doesn't, then you have the makings of an extremely dangerous situation for next year in Brazil, where anyway renovation is not taking place. So we're likely to see a sharp fall in agricultural yields. And then the simple fact that the cane that's being cut today and will be sprouting in a couple of months' time is going to be severely affected by lack of rainfall. Then you have La Nina coming with a possible/probable effect on the first half of the rainy season. So I think you can make a very strong case for weather risks coming on top of low stocks, and as you said, logistics for this year, logistics in Brazil, meaning that somebody somewhere is going to look for sugar that doesn't exist, and as we know, that causes real jitters.
Yeah,
So I'm of the opposite prejudice, but I come back to our first point, which is I don't have much conviction.
no, I'm an extremely nervous bear. I mean, all it takes is for a problem in Santos port of any description, whether that's road and rail coming into the port or vessels berthing or problems with the channel, any problem like that, and the sugar market will react. Brazil is going to supply 3/4 of the world's raw sugar this year, and most of that comes through Santos. So where I'm bearish, as you say, it's a low conviction view, and the market doesn't have a lot of cushion in it. There's not a lot of safety or wiggle room in the market. Most of the stock build that we've seen in the last couple of years has been in Brazil and India, the world's two biggest sugar producers. What we really need to be in a much more comfortable position is that stock to be where it's needed. The big consuming deficit regions. So yes, low conviction bear. I said in a different conference I was speaking at a couple of weeks ago, I said I was a nervous bear, and I still think that's true. I don't think I'm alone as well, judging by how quickly a lot of the speculators bought back their shorts. I think there's a lot of nervous bears out there.
Yes, just two more points before we ought to finish. Number one, you just mentioned that the funds had bought back their shorts, and I completely agree. But my view is that the function of the non-index funds is to carry a pretty big long as a counterweight to the natural short that the producers always carry, bearing in mind that consumers almost never buy forward. So you've got this huge overhang of the producer short. The trade are pretty beaten up at the moment and aren't doing their bit. So it does fall on the non-index funds to I think, to be their natural position should be long of about 100,000 lots. And at the moment, I would agree with you, they're probably square. So there is a potential there for the funds to do on the way up what they did on the way down. Yeah.
It's possible. It's interesting as well. The open interest in the raw sugar market today is the lowest it's been since November 2022. And at that time, we were in and around 17 cents and had been in a sideways market for 18 months. And then what followed from there was a large wave of speculative buying, and the market ultimately ended up at 28 cents. So if history repeats, then it's possible that this low open interest we've got at the moment does precede some spec buying. I struggle with the idea that the speculators will build their long unless there's a good reason for them to do it. And I don't think at the moment the dry weather in Brazil is compelling enough. I think you need to see a much bigger disturbance in the sugar market. Also, I know that wheat, corn, cocoa, coffee, they're not sugar, but all of those markets are considerably weaker than they have been in the recent past as well. So as a food commodity sector, I don't think there's a very compelling story at the moment for the specs. And from a sugar order flow point of view, the flat prices, the futures has been higher, but the spreads have actually remained quite weak. And so if you're a momentum fund or anyone that doesn't really look at the fundamentals, again, I don't see a huge trigger for you at the moment. So yes, it's possible the speculators build up a new long position. It's also equally possible they just stay out of the sugar market or indeed rebuild their shorts. So I'm trying to keep a bit of an open mind on that.
Very fair. Last question, very topically, India. I read today that a report that India had increased cane area by 3%. It seems very late for such a big increase. Do you think some of that is for the following year? And how do you see India in the coming 12 months?
So I try to be an optimist always. One of the interesting things from last year was if you go back to about this time last year when it was clear the monsoon was behaving erratically, there were some voices in the Indian industry who made quite a big fuss about the extent of the crop damage and how low the crop could go. And as a result, the government quite sensibly decided to stop authorising sugar exports and also to reduce the amount of sucrose that could go into ethanol. And in the end, the crop wasn't as low as many people feared. And so for the Indian industry, that meant fewer sources of revenue were available to them. If you look with hindsight at last year's monsoon, overall India is 6% lower than normal. But if you look at some of the sugarcane regions in Maharashtra and in Uttar Pradesh, actually the monsoon was relatively normal. So I personally don't think the damage last year was as bad as people remember. And so I'm actually quite optimistic about the Indian cane acreage for this season. I don't necessarily see why it should be particularly poor. So if now the current 2024 monsoon is normal, I can see a situation where India is able to make 31 million tons of sugar, maybe a little bit more for next season. So granted, it's not a big surplus, but if consumption is somewhere near 29 and 30, it is a second successive year of India building sugar stock. And so I could see a situation where the government then finds a way to allow a small amount of sugar export, in addition to allowing some of this surplus to be diverted back into ethanol. So, as I say, I like to be an optimist around Indian cane, ready to be proved wrong, but I do believe that India could be a surplus producer again in the coming season.
So if they produce 31 million next year, how much would you see as diversion to on top of that? How much sucrose will be diverted to ethanol? 1 or 2 million tons?
No, I suspect maybe closer to 3, maybe even a little bit more, because I think that some of the sugar stock that's been built this season, that's just finished or finishing, will enable the mills to allocate more molasses to ethanol at the start of the coming season, because there'll be spare stock available, so the pressure at the beginning of the crush will be reduced. So I think the ethanol diversion on the sugar front could be a bit higher than 1 or 2 million tons. And then also, if all goes well, we could potentially be looking at 1 million tons or so of sugar exports too. That is possible. And I know at the moment with the sugar market in and around 19 cents, those exports aren't necessarily workable or not profitable. But I'm sure the Indian government is resourceful enough to find a way to make things work. So yeah, I'm optimistic on Indian prospects and quite possibly very wrong, but I prefer to be optimistic than wrong, and wrong rather than pessimistic and right.
So you would see 31 million tons of sugar plus, say, 3 million tons of diversion. That would make a total sucrose production of 34, which is certainly possible, but would require the ducks to form an orderly row. I think we would both agree that India is unlikely to be a major player next year, but the threat will always be there. And I do think that if by chance my worry or expectation of a real bull market because of the severe lack of rain in Centre-South Brazil, if that happens, then I think India would be there to cap any big price rise. So I think on that score we can call it a day and
Lovely
say thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great, enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
Okay.